illustration I've never forgot, and it intrigued me, and I didn't know my Bible very well. So he said this. He said he went to a trip to Israel, and when he was there, he wasn't leading the trip. A lot of pastors do, and probably give input to the guide group, but he was on the tour. He wanted to see all the places and so forth. And at one point they stopped. The people from the bus were over in something, and he stops and he's watching, and he sees this field with literally a shepherd. This shepherd about the sheep. He had a question for him. And he walked over and he said, "Is it true," and the man spoke English, fortunately, is it true that these sheep won't listen to anybody else but you?" So he said to him, "Give it a try." He said, "I'm going to give you the words I would use." And so he gave him a couple of different, like one was a sentence and then there was a couple of words. So he says, "Yeah, go ahead, have at it." So John gets up there, and first he starts with a tone a little bit more than, he didn't shout, but, the sheep were all over the place, a lot of them. He said there's probably about 80 of them. And he starts using the words, and he's thinking they don't hear me. So he starts getting louder, and he does this for like 2 minutes, and he's using everything. He's using everything he can. And finally, he's almost screaming, and the most he got was a couple of sheep stopped grazing, looked over at him. Nothing moved. So then when he's done, John Akers says to him, "Now you do it." So the guy smiled, and he just stood up. He was sitting down. He stood up, and just in a voice, just above talking voice, John said, he just gave one command. Every sheep, he said, looked up, and he gave a second command, and every one of them walked toward him. And John was delighted, because it made this passage come so alive to him as a pastor when he was going to teach it. He said this was like an amazing, amazing thing. So I never forgot that story, and it's the perfect illustration of trust, of protection, and of loyalty when you look at that, and probably other things too. That's why the imagery of a sheep and shepherd is so common throughout the whole Bible, Old Testament and New. Okay, and particularly Jesus uses it here to depict his unique relationship with his people, with his followers, the people that, of course, are supposed to be loyal to God and listen to him. And then also, these are the same sheep that were entrusted to Jesus from the Father. Now, that sounds a little crazy to us when you think it, but if you read John 17, we're not going to do it. If you read there, I think it's like verses like 8, 9, 10, right in there, he's actually praying. It's his high priestly prayer. It's the day he's going to die, that night. And he prays for himself, then he prays for his disciples, then he prays for all who would come to believe in him, which means he prayed for all of us who believe. So he gets up there, like he's there, speaking to the Father, saying all this. And what he says in there, basically, is that not all people are his sheep. Not all people are believers. And that confuses people a lot of times. They say, wait a minute, aren't we all the children of God? I think I mentioned this last week or the week before. Aren't we all the children of God? If you mean it this way, we are all God's creation, but we don't all belong to him because a number of us won't follow him. And so his sheep know his voice. Those that are not his sheep do not hear his voice when he's speaking. And so that's what, is really significant about this whole passage. But think what we've seen over the past couple of weeks. If you've been with us, great. If not, I'm going to explain a little bit of it so it'll catch you up a little bit. But think of what we've seen in the Gospel of John these last couple of weeks. And think about Jesus using his surroundings to point to himself. This is what he's doing. And in fulfillment of what the prophets had foretold. So Jesus says, in effect, in John 6, he says, you want manna from heaven? Because he fed the 5,000. And the people, after he did that, and remember, there was like 15,000 or 20,000 because they only counted the men. And the women and children were all there as well. So he feeds them. He goes across Galilee. All of a sudden, by the time he gets there, he's not there probably a very short time with his disciples, and the crowds gather. And he says, you've come here because you want the food I gave to them over there, which many of them were in the crowd over there. And he's starting to encourage them, don't look and work for the food, of today that perishes, but look to the food that will feed you forever. And that's when he says, I am the bread of life. Feed on me. I'm the bread of life. And we talked about that. And then he says to his people who are looking for what they could get right now. That's what many of us do that. We get so busy with life that we're not thinking of spiritual things. I'll just ask you a question. You don't have to answer it. I just want you to think of this. How frequently do you think of eternity? And when you do, how much does it impact your actions of today? For many of us, even Christians, it's not a lot, because we're thinking the here and the now. What do I need today? What do I want today? And that's what we're thinking. What can I get today? How can I get it? That's what we think of. Christ is using everything he can in his surroundings throughout the Gospel of John to show them this is the physical, but the spiritual is far better. Far better. Now, you still need the physical, and God says he'll provide it. That's the Lord's Prayer, right? Give us today our daily bread. So it's not that God ignores that part. God says he provides it. But what he's really looking at, right, and what he really wants us to see is what's beyond the daily bread. And that's the important stuff. So he's using the physical things to explain the spiritual. And then transitioning to the scene of the Feast of Tabernacles, that was last week, and in chapters 7 and 8, it's a big feast, seventh feast of the year for the Jews, and it commemorated the time that they wandered in the wilderness. And they were guided by God, by an angel of the Lord, at night by a pillar of fire, during the day by a cloud in that same pillar. That's how they were led. And so it's as if Jesus is saying, you want burning torches like they have at the Feast of Tabernacle, because they're remembering back to God leading them? You want the light in the desert? Do you want that? And this is what he's basically saying. You want that pillar of fire in the desert? Then come to me. I am the light of the world. All of that was me. That was me. That's what he's saying. Jesus is making declarations of deity. And this is why he had many people that hated him, because he challenged the establishment, and many people that fell at their knees and worshiped him. Those are the two responses that Jesus got most. Okay? So very, very powerful. Jesus says, come to me, I'll lead you out of the darkness. I'll make you shine like the stars in the heavens. And then surely it's no coincidence that on the heels of that, we go to chapter 9, which we didn't look at, but I encourage you to read it. Jesus just talked about being the light, and then this whole chapter is taken up with one event, which is significant. It's the healing of a man who was born into darkness. He was blind, and Jesus heals him. And he does it on the Sabbath. So not only did Jesus talk about being the light, he demonstrated giving the light. And he gave it to this man, putting mud on his eyes. If you remember, he spit in the dirt. I think he did that to, force a confrontation, if you will, because Jesus could have done that verbally. He did it many times. So why did he do that? Because it was on the Sabbath, and they would consider this a work to bend down, spit in the mud, and put it on his eyes. So it's a work. So Jesus immediately caused a kerfuffle in the crowd. So that's what was going on in this. So the blind man comes to faith. Now, this is really interesting. You know how the blind were treated in Jesus' day? They were fend for yourself. Maybe a family member too would help. But any extra mouth to feed, this is foreign to us. Because if you come here, even if you walked across the border or wherever you came from, and you walked out there, you won't starve. There are food centers, there's churches, there's people, there's all kinds of things. You can get food every day. You can get shelter every day. You can get treated in our hospitals every day. You can have all of that. So we don't get this as Americans, but the Jewish people lived truly by faith, truly by provision, truly by what's there. And if they worried about it, they weren't feeding you. That's not what they were going to do. So the blind men were on the sides of the roads, begging, just for whatever, just sometimes calling out, sometimes just holding their cup out, and so forth. So this is what's going on in chapter 9, and Jesus comes and speaks to him, and so he's an outcast. the leading establishment, all the leaders, they're the in crowd. They can't see him for who he is. But he said to the blind man, when after he healed him, Jesus, he never saw Jesus till later, physically with his eyes, because he said, he spit and put the mud on his eyes. He said, go wash off in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. And Jesus walked away. So he never knew what he looked like. But when he got healed, people realized who it was, brought him to the Pharisees, the religious leaders, the educated, the in crowd, the ones that were there. And they said to him, this man is healed from that guy that you told us about, the itinerant preacher. So they call this guy in, and, were you born blind? He said, I was. He said, how is it that you now see? He said, I could tell you, I don't know. This man healed me. There's a little bit more there, but to make it a little shorter, he healed me. And he says, and they start questioning him like, well, maybe you weren't blind. Maybe that didn't happen. And, call his parents in here. So they called his parents, and the parents, they asked him, and they said, this is our son. And he was born blind. How he can now see, we don't know. They were afraid. The Bible tells us that, of the leaders, because you'd be put out of the synagogue. He says, how that happened, we cannot tell. But ask him. He's of age. Wouldn't you love to do that to your kid? You put it on them. They always put it on you. Yeah, ask him. Find out why he did that. So they asked, they say all this, and then they call the son back in. And they start really asking questions. Well, who is this? Well, he's a prophet. And he said, prophet, we don't follow him, we follow Moses. And he says, we don't know anything about this man. And the blind man says, now that is really incredible. Because here's a man that opened the eyes of a blind man, and you don't even know who he is. What a testimony of what Jesus is teaching about being the light. So he says this to him, and as that's finishing up, they throw him out of the synagogue. They say, you were born in utter sin. And they throw him out of the synagogue, which we think, people that are reading this and looking at this, the scholars think, means don't come back to the synagogue. Right? Not just get out of here for today, but don't come back. So he left. Jesus heard about it and found him. And he said to him, it's an incredible passage right there in this same section in chapter 9. And I want to read it because I think it's really, really good. But he says this. Jesus heard that he threw him out. He came to him, found him. He says, do you believe in the Son of Man? Which is an Old Testament figure of the coming of Messiah. And he says, do you believe in the Son of Man? He says, who is he, sir? The man asked. Tell me so that I may believe in him. So Jesus said, you have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you now. And then he says, the man said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. The Greek word they use is a really interesting word. What it actually means is he prostrated himself and kissed his feet. So they just rendered it worship, right? Which is what it was. And he said he worshiped him. Jesus said this, for judgment I have come into the world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. And some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, what? Are we blind also? This is a great answer. Jesus said, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you see, your guilt remains. So the judgment continued to be upon the leaders of the nation because they missed the Messiah, even in all the signs. So Jesus says, I am that light. And then he gave the man light, and everybody in Jerusalem knew it. So it was a tough thing going back and forth. But then we come to the passage that Mike read, and they're still at Jerusalem. They're still up there, and he says, I tell you the truth, still in the same crowd, still where they were, going back and forth with him. And he says, I tell you the truth, the man who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but some other way, is not the shepherd. Right? And then it goes on to everything that we just heard. So it was really an amazing thing because Jesus, like any good rabbi, right, when he said this and he told them your sin remains, like any good rabbi that gets someone upset, what does he do? He makes them more upset. And that's what he was doing because he wanted them to see. He drew the line in the sand always. As Christians, I just want to point this out, and that's the only reason I'm going back to this because we didn't cover 9, is that Jesus drew the line in the sand. You had to make a decision if you met him. He either is who he says or he's not. And what that decision was on your part could mean a difference for you on where you spent the rest of your life, where you spent, whether you were in the synagogue or out. So Jesus was calling people to a commitment to forsake the visible things of the world and said, don't worry, I've got this and a billion times more for you, waiting for you. So don't worry about this stuff. But you have to follow. So when he says that at the end of 9:32, the judgment and so forth, that I came for judgment. I was asked recently, so I want to tell it to you guys, if you were reading earlier on in John 3:17, he says that I did not come, I was not sent into the world to condemn the world. That means judgment. But then here he says, somebody asked me this one time, he said, I got a contradiction for you. The Bible contradicts itself. Okay, great, give it to me. So they gave me this, and I said, no, you're missing the parable. You're missing what he's saying. Here's what he's saying. When he comes, he didn't come here to judge, he came to save us. Okay? He didn't come for that. But his presence here and him speaking about who he is and you denying him, he's forcing people to make a judgment. That's what he's doing. They could, after he died and rose, they could still come, right? If they received Christ, but he made them declare when he was with them. And so that's what he was talking to the blind man about. And it was a great passage. So we go on from there, and in other words, he's saying this in this whole thing to those Pharisees and to everybody. If you knew you were helpless, you could get help, because that's who I'm here for. If you knew, the only way you know that, or we admit that, is if we're humble. So a requirement, absolute requirement, probably the most important requirement, maybe the only requirement, to see Christ is for you to be humble and to understand he's God and you're not. If you can't see that, you will be blind to all that he does. And you'll say, that was science. I could explain that from this. Oh, that's coincidence. And that's what we hear people doing all the time, right? So the blindness will leave you guilty of sin and destined for judgment. So this is the condition of humanity all around us. Perhaps you're sitting here and you've not made that decision. That's okay. I'm glad you're here. And this is another time that we're all being confronted with Jesus, his own words. Okay? So you believe that maybe you know the way life should be lived, or you sit in final authority of what's true and what's not. You say, this is what I believe. And you can believe what you want, but this is what I believe. And really, for me, it's not a matter of what I believe or you believe. It's what we were told, and then believe on that. So you have to know why you believe what you believe. And so that's the bigger picture. You may think all I have to do is, do more good than bad. Don't wreck my life. Don't destroy people. Don't rob any banks. Don't kill anybody. Whatever it might be. And I'm in. And a lot of people do think that. But in this parable, it's called in John 6 a figure of speech. Again, it's translated that way too. It's a Greek word. But that word could mean parable. It could mean proverb. It could mean simile. It could mean allegory. It could mean fable even, right, when they use it. But here, it's clearly, by its context, he's talking about, making it's a figure of speech. So what it means is Jesus is giving an analogy between the shepherd and his sheep, between Jesus and his followers. And as it happens so often, here's another case when Jesus tries a figure of speech and people end up going, huh? I don't get it. Now we think right away, because we think we're really smart, more educated, and more brilliant than those in the first century, that wouldn't happen to me. But fact is, they were more educated than us in many ways. Not the same factual data, but a greater education in the way they approached the world. And so, and they were looking going, I don't get it, I don't get it, I don't get it. Because they kept seeing the physical. It's always the physical. The bread that came down, the light of the temple and the light in the desert. We want that. No, that's not what you want. Jesus said, that's a desire. I know why you desire it, but every one of those desires is ultimately met in Christ. It will not be met on this planet. It cannot be, right? So that's the picture. Now, we think of the parable, right, as well. Jesus was a master storyteller, so he used these cool stories to help people understand what he was saying. The fact is, even his disciples didn't understand when he got done. Almost every one of them, you read the next thing and it says, and Jesus pulled them aside to explain it to them. Because they too were thinking, this is a physical kingdom, what's coming here? You know, Jesus is going to rise up, he's getting an army, we're going to be right in there with him, we're going to be, you know, we're going to have places in the kingdom, right? That's why all these, you know, when you see these, I think I might have said this, but these elections that go on, you see all these young people, you know, working for the candidate, and their candidate loses, let's say, right? It happens to everybody. They're demoralized. Why? They were thinking the next 4 years they're going to have a position, maybe with the White House, maybe in this, maybe gone. And why are they so demoralized? Why do they need to go to their safe places and you know, do whatever and pet the animals? You know, because why? Because they've not been taught how to lose. They've not been taught how to think critically. They've not been taught these things. Right? Best class I ever had, by the way, ever in my life, and I still read the book, my textbook, is logic. And logic is how to use your mind. How you do it, where you can reason sequentially, figure things out. So when I look at that, it gives you, you know, you work in syllogisms, you work in all kinds of things, and you can figure out if this, then that. If this, then that. And you draw conclusions based on these things. The generations coming up, for the most part, do not have that skill anymore. Logic was taught in every school up until the 19-something. Then they removed it. I wonder why. Right? But not there. So anyway, so this was really clear. Jesus compares himself to a shepherd, right? First as a shepherd of the sheep, then second as the gate or the door for the sheep. So looking real quick at that, you know, he compares himself to a shepherd. One of the most familiar imagery or images in the Old Testament and throughout the ancient world. Everybody knew what a shepherd and the sheep were, and they knew the bond between them. It was just commonplace. And shepherds weren't considered high on the social scale. They were a little bit more of the outcast class, right? They're working out there in the fields. They smell. You know, it's like that's what they're doing. And so my first trip to Scotland, I've been there many times. My grandparents were from there, and my first trip, I took a ride from where I was doing ministry, about 2 hours away, get up to this place. I knew where they were. I had the address. My grandmother, I grew up while she was alive in our house. So my grandmother lived with us till she passed, and I was in my late 20s. But when I went there, I had heard so much about where she lived. I get there, I look at it, I run into the place, great story sometime, but I see the house. I see it hadn't changed from her description at all. There were salmon jumping in the Tweed River, and there were more sheep than people. I mean, on the hillside, it was the most idyllic picture I've ever seen. And the thing that really impressed upon me is we don't see anything like this in America, because we don't take care of sheep in the same ways they take care of sheep over there. So here's what you would have had over there, and I want to give you, to make the parable come alive to you, or the analogy. Most families would have had a sheep pen, okay, most of them. And it would either be real close to the house or adjoining the house to make it safe. And then they would build a fence around it made of stone. Then they would put thorny briars on the top of it. They would have one entrance and one only. And they had to watch out for two things: animals that preyed on sheep and people who preyed on sheep. So they would have either a shepherd, if they had a big enough flock. You know, they had a gatekeeper, usually in the late part of the night, the late watches of the night. So you had a gatekeeper that stood by the gate, because in a big sheep pen with no light, guess what? Somebody could come through that gate. An animal, whatever. So you would have that. And so, you know, some families came together and combined their flocks, which then it's really important that the sheep know the shepherd's name, because when you try to separate them out in the morning to bring them out, they've got to follow the right person. And the sheep would do that. The shepherd would call his own. They would move from the sheep. The other ones wouldn't move. So they'd be making their way through. So they would separate sheep by that methodology, just by calling out. Now, when I think of this, the gatekeeper, right, he watches. He lets the shepherd in. The shepherd always, if it's his sheep, he uses the gate. That's how he gets in. And so you can understand, anyone who climbs over the fence instead of using a gate is probably not the shepherd. So Maura and I watch these TV shows sometimes at night when we're eating dinner, and we like cop shows because when the cop gets the call, they get only so much information, and we like to puzzle through it while they're doing it and think of like, what do you think's going on here? What's happening here? What's happening here? And I used to be a police chaplain. I rode with the police. I'd be out on the tours with them all the time and riding. So it was an enjoyable like kind of thing. And you're watching and you think, are you going to be right? Are you going to be right? And this is what's going on. So we watched this one show and it comes up, and this was not too long ago, and the police get a call and they say there's an active burglary. Someone's in the house, at whatever the address is. A neighbor called. Boom, that's all they got. So the lights and sirens, getting there as quickly as they can. They pull up and the neighbor tells them, still in there. Great, makes our life a lot easier. So they bang on the door, which they'll always do before they kick the door down. They bang on the door and the guy answers the door. And so they immediately put him in handcuffs, drag him out, and he's like, no. And it's like, don't say a word yet. They're checking him and doing all this stuff. What's your name? Give me your ID. Give me all the stuff that they would do. And then they let him explain the story. No. This is my father's house. They went away on vacation, right? He says, I live here sometime, not all the time. He said, this is one of the times I am. I locked myself out. I climbed through the window. So like, we'll see. So, and again, they don't give him any leeway. So they made calls. They actually got his parents on the phone. Okay. They handcuff him in a whole bit. But you can understand why the neighbor thought what was going on. So Jesus is painting this picture. Same thing. And that's what we would see. So if we saw someone climbing in someone's window, your neighbor, and that's not him, you're like, 911. That's what we're doing. That's what Jesus is saying. This is what's going on, as they look at that. So he calls, everybody has a fence. These are your sheep. You use the door. He calls the sheep by name, leads them out because they know his voice. They don't follow the voice of a stranger. That's the basic part of the story. And so, at least it seems basic, but he's saying an awful lot. And I'm going to give you a few things. By implication, because who was in the crowd? Remember who's in the crowd? Not just his followers. You have his antagonists. You have people that are sitting on the fence, no pun intended, wondering, is this the guy we're waiting for? You have others that are following and made that decision. So you have everybody. So Jesus is speaking, right? This is what you got going on. And so by implication, he says, my opponents are sheep rustlers. Because he says in that passage that was read, the watchman opens the gate for the shepherd, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own and so forth. And he leads them when he brings them out of there, and because they know his voice. But they will not follow a stranger. In fact, they run away from him because they don't recognize the stranger's voice. Therefore, Jesus said, I tell you the truth, I am the gate of the sheep. All who ever came before me were thieves and robbers. What do you mean before me? There were lots of messiahs that rose up and claimed, I'm him. They did. And many people followed each time. In fact, when the disciples got arrested, after Jesus died, rose, and ascended, and they realized this is the Messiah in the resurrection, where did they go? Peter went out and preached with John right in the center of the city of Jerusalem, right where they were being hunted down to be arrested as followers of Jesus. They stood up, they preached the moral guilt of the people. And when they did that, they were naturally arrested. Right? That's what a historian would say. That looks true because that's what would happen. So they get arrested, they get brought in, they get questioned, all this stuff happens. And they realize through this guy was with that guy that we got rid of, right? That we got out of here. And so he's making this, he stands up and he preaches the moral guilt of the leader, saying, you, this Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified, he's the Messiah. You killed him. Don't you wish for preachers like that today? Right? Everybody's trying to be politically correct. But Peter stood up there knowing full well, guess what was going to happen? You're getting arrested. At that point, because of what he saw, because of who he knew, and because he was convinced of eternity, he knew, you can take my life, but you can't take my soul, my spirit. So, and you can't take it unless God says it's time. That's what he would have known. They arrest him, they beat him, but Gamaliel, you know what he comes to their defense? Gamaliel is Paul's teacher, the Apostle Paul. We know about him from history outside the Bible even. So he was Paul's teacher. He tells the whole Sanhedrin, the Jewish court, when they want to kill these guys, wait a minute. We've done this before. Many people have arisen, claimed they were somebody, like the Messiah. And guess what? We killed them. We did this, we did that. And he says, you made him a martyr, basically, in many, many times. Don't do this. He says, don't do anything. Let him go. Because if this is not from God, it will die out. If it is from God, you will find yourself fighting with God. So I guess maybe they paused on that one and said, okay, and they let Peter go. And where was he the next day? Same thing, preaching right in the same streets. And this went on, and people were coming to faith, and it was an amazing, amazing thing. So throughout the Old Testament, loads of things going on. Listen to Jeremiah 23. And remember, he just told his opponents that they're sheep stealers, they're sheep rustlers. They tell them they're misleading, they're misdirecting, they're false shepherds. And listen to Jeremiah. Jeremiah was 600 years before Jesus came. Speaking of Israel and speaking of Israel's leaders, he says this, and this is chapter 23 if you want to look at it at some point. Woe to the shepherds who are destroying and scattering the sheep of my pasture, declares the Lord. Because you have scattered my flock and driven them away and have not bestowed care on them. I will bestow punishment on you, declares the Lord. These are his people. Okay? These are the Jews. Punishment is coming. It's like a parent to their kid. This won't stand. I myself, God says, will gather the remnant of my flock, the believers, the sheep, out of all the countries that I've driven them, where I have driven them, and will bring them back to their pasture where they will be fruitful and increase in number. I will place the shepherds over them who will tend them, and they will no longer be afraid or terrified, nor will any be missing. Love that. Now, I've been a part of a lot of leadership trainings, sometimes listening, sometimes teaching as I got older and so forth. And I'm going to tell you one thing I learned in all of my leadership training, and this is the basis of leadership, is as the leader goes, so goes the follower. As the shepherd goes, so go the sheep. If the shepherds are corrupt, the sheep will ultimately and fairly quickly become corrupt. We look at our own country over the years, different administrations, different times, but we look at some crazy stuff recently. We're looking at we can't define a woman. That's a crazy thing, right? And if it's not to somebody, it means we've been the frog in the kettle. It's been happening, that it's no surprise anymore. And we're just okay. And what do you think God would think? He created them male and female. That's what he says, right? But now you could be born at birth as a male, but you're actually trapped in a female's body, or vice versa. But we can change that when you're 6 years old or 4 years old and do all kinds of mutilation and everything. That's where we are. That's where America is at. That's where our leaders, and I use all of it, you can put them all together in some cases, right? This is where we've gone. Guess what? You know where those leaders were educated? In our best colleges. Where's our education system? That should tell you something. Should tell you something, right? So it's an amazing thing when we look at that. Now, when you read that passage, it's amazing, okay? We've been by the way, it's churches too. Churches getting that same thing. Pastors do that. Pastors all of a sudden go, well, maybe that's not really true. Maybe it really didn't mean that. And the moment you crack that door, you're just, now who's the judge of the scripture? You are. Instead of God giving truth, we're saying, I'll take this piece, but not this piece. That truth fits me. This one does not, right? That is crazy, right? If you think about it, and we're going to talk about that another time, but we think about that, that's what we do. Church leaders have done it. They bought into world philosophies, and I know lots of pastors that I've known, and they're off the reservation. Down some road of, well, we just do this because it's pragmatic versus true. And that's a bad place. So throughout the Old Testament, one of the greatest blessings God ever gave was faithful shepherds to his people. They thought of the welfare of the flock, not their own comfort. They were courageous at times. They were dauntless. They were compassionate. And one of the worst things that they ever could see in Israel's history, and you can go read it, it's all there, and in our history too, is they had false leaders, false shepherds, false people. And they cared only about their own safety, their own pocketbook. They gorged upon the meat of the flock, right? They fleeced the sheep for their own gain. This is what they were doing. And Jesus compares many of the Jewish leaders of his day with this, right? He calls them strangers and thieves. They sneak in. They lead people astray, teaching them what was false. And they were not good for the sheep. He also says you need to go on your guard. It's on you. If you have a bad shepherd, get rid of him. Right? I would just tell you that. And that's an important thing. So when you're looking, the Bereans did this with the Apostle Paul. If you look at Acts 17, the Apostle Paul was preaching some very strange things. A man rose from the dead. It was Messiah. This is what the scriptures taught. So the Jews that were at Berea listened to Paul for his hours that he was preaching. And when they got done, they said, we'll see you here again tomorrow. And then it says, great statement. It says, they went to their homes and then they searched the scriptures each day to see if these things were true that Paul was talking about. Amen. Because if it's not matching up with what we have, then that's going to be a problem. And they did, and the Berean church followed him in great numbers. So that's a lot of really good stuff. All right, let me give you a few things here. We look at things, we kind of get pulled aside. There's lots of things that I think happen to us. We have to be on guard against things, but in the end, the shepherds that are bad are going to turn us away from God. And so we have to be on guard all the time. Now, when I think through this and I look at all this, I think, okay, what is God actually saying here? You know what God is saying? Jesus is saying, supremacy sits with me. That's what he's saying. He's the good shepherd. Okay, we're going to talk about I am the shepherd, good shepherd next week. But he says this. So I'm going to give you a couple of things. Many of us have been in churches. Many of us have made a commitment to God. Christian, when I say many of us, I go beyond this, our little church here. I'm talking about Christians everywhere. We have made commitments. But then you know what's happened? We made a commitment. It sounded right. I did it here. It was great till other things looked better. Then I would do that a little bit, but then I would come back because I'd feel, something bad happened and God's getting me. Or I would go over there, or I stayed there for a while, and then I'd realize, I did read this, or we'd hear a sermon somewhere, or somebody would say something, and you hear somebody sharing their faith, and you're going, I should really go back and look at that. And this is what we've done so frequently. And then we try to hold both. I want the world, and I want Jesus. And you can't hold Jesus in one hand and junk in the other. You just can't, right? You can't do it with anything, by the way. You can't say a little bit of this, a little bit of this, a little bit of this, everything in moderation. You've heard that expression? I used to preach to parents because I did a lot of parent seminars in high schools. And one of the things I would say to the parents is this. How many of you tell your children, and I said, don't put your hands up. How many tell your children, to do things in moderation, right? So almost every hand went up. It's okay. So let me ask you this. I want you to do this. And this you could do out loud if you'd like. Name one person in history that made a difference in moderation. That's the answer I get every time. You can't name one. Can't do it. Why? Because you have to be sold out for what you're doing to make a difference in anything. In your company, in your family, in your faith, in everything. If you're not that, you're not anything. You're just marking time and hoping the kids do okay, let them make their choices, do whatever. We don't lead children a lot of times anymore. We say we want them to decide. Well, if they're watching you, which they do, they're going to decide that nothing is important. Doesn't matter. Do what you want. It's your decision. It's better for you to do that. And we're destroying a generation. That's what we're seeing. So we look at it and say, we can't keep doing that. That's, and this is what Jesus is saying to them. It's, he goes on. So we're going to go jump to the end of this section, and he says this. There's an assumed, thing with the church. We've actually heard people. We've actually heard the voice of God at different times, and then we get involved in things. And you know what? Here's the hardest part for Americans. We get involved in what we would all call good things. But good things can be thieves and robbers as well. Not just teachers. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, anything that takes you from a focus on Jesus is a thief. It's stealing something, right? It takes it from you. They rob something from you. You don't even know it a lot of times, right? So we think of this, you're taking it, they're doing it. So we think, well, what kind of good things? So you're a college student. I'll just pick, you're a college student, you're out of the gate, the whole world is before you, or you're going to college. Let's say you're a junior in high school when you got to make these decisions. Oh, I'm going to this one. I got good grades. And everything in this kid's home was sacrificed for the grade, because mom and dad said, get the grade, you will be successful. Not true. Not true. Seen it over and over and over again. You might be successful at getting in the college you want to get into. And we promised a generation of kids that if you go to college, you get a degree, you will get a job and it will pay well. My mother called me years ago. She was the CEO's secretary for Allied Signal, Bendix, and all this. So she was a CEO, assistant CEO, and we would talk around the dinner table at times, and I'm like 20 years old, maybe a little younger. And she starts talking about things. So I'm at where she calls me up and she says, hey, computers were pretty new. Give you a little idea how old I am. Computers were pretty new in the workplace. They had mainframes, of course. She calls me up and says, you got anybody that can work a computer? I said, you work for an $18 billion company. You don't have anybody that can work a computer? She said, nope. She goes, got a lot of college-educated people. Wow. Not one of them can do what we need. I said, in fact, I do. I have two. Not me. I said, I have two. Send them over, fix the stuff, right? How does that happen? Because we're focused on the wrong things. That's all it is. We're focused on the wrong things. You got to do this. You know why? Because the world around you says that. Says that. You know why they didn't believe in Jesus? Because the world around them said it can't be him. Look at him. He has no pedigree. He's not anybody. He didn't get formally educated. He didn't learn from the rabbis. He didn't do this. He didn't do that. He didn't, who is he? We don't, that's not who we, you know why? They had an idea of what the prophets meant. They thought. They were not open. They were like, do you ever, as a parent, do this? You say to your kid wants to do something. No. This is the path. This is the path. I'm telling you. This is the path. A lot of parents did that. That's most of the counseling for kids I had to do is with their parents. To help them understand. No, this is not what you want to do. Believe me. And so we would talk about this, and this goes on. But it happens to us too. People, Sunday used to be, as an example, a place and a time to meet at church. But then, and this happened on my watch, I was a coach, and my kids played ball. And I would say, not on Sundays. It's, if you want to do something in the afternoon or whatever, it's fine, but no. And his coach called me one time, could they do that? No. And I said, and it's just, listen, I can explain it if you want to hear it, but that's just the way we operate. And so, as people go, oh, but does the Bible say you can't do, that you have to come to church every week? No. Nope, you can't do it. That's a work. It doesn't help you. It doesn't check your box. It doesn't make God more happy that you're in church in that way. Because if we're operating on that system and we count up the times, I went 52 times this year. That's like, I didn't miss a Sunday. That's incredible, right? God's going to love me. He doesn't love you for that. Do you love your kids for that? No, you don't. If you do, you got a problem. But you don't. Why? Because you love your kids because they're your kids, right? And you want them to succeed. So you're giving them advice. It's not always right, but you're helping them. You want to see them do well. You're pushing them forward, right? And Jesus, you look at him and we understand these things. But he's talking to these people about I'm the way, I'm the gate, I'm the truth, I'm this, I'm the light, I'm these things. They can't see it. Why? Because they know what society has taught them. They know what they think. They know where they're going. And now they're sitting on the judgment seat. They don't know that there's a bigger judgment seat. And that's an amazing thing. So, you know what? Americans love options, don't we? You like options? You go to the supermarket, you go down the potato chip aisle. It's the longest aisle in the supermarket. And it's like, you're looking in and you're saying, and if you're a potato chip person, this is like a little bit of heaven. You're walking through, more is a little bit of a potato chip person. So you go through and they got these, they got those without salt. Who would buy those? Like you want to do that, go buy potatoes, right? And make chips out of them, whatever. But it's like, who would do that? Then you see different flavors infused with all kinds of stuff, totally unhealthy, all of it. But they have all this, and if you want that, you can get it. We love options. We're brought up on options. Remember the old Burger King commercial? Have it your way. You know what this world teaches? It's all about you, me, self, I. All those, and we like that. But we like the options. We like the options, everything. How many colleges you apply to? 40? Why? You know what I mean? You know, how many? It's just like what we do. It's options, options, options. Many people think that the road to heaven is wide and the road to hell is narrow. And only a few people do it, the ones that really foul up their lives. The Hitlers, the Stalins, those people. They're not going to heaven. But me, as long as I don't do too much wrong, I'll be in. Does that sound like Jesus? No. He's the exact opposite. He said, the road to heaven, the way to heaven is narrow. Few people find it. The road to hell is wide. And the crowds are going. Right? Is God happy about that? No. Okay? But when you look at this, that's the truth. And Jesus then says, and I'm the gate. You have to go through the gate to be in his sheep pen. Because only the shepherd and his sheep come through the gate. That's it. And if people didn't go through the gate, they're not in. They're not part of his fold. Right? Just not in. But we like these options. And people, I have this conversation with people, you know, it's pretty exclusive of you to think that your way is the only way. Stop right there. It's not my way. It's not my way. I had to come to reckon with that too. So, but if there is an only way, I want it. Just going to tell you that. And from what I'm reading, everything I see, it's one way. One way. And that's not options. We think, no, it's like all these paths. The religions are all paths and they're all leading to the same mountaintop. No. Right? No. I'll tell you something about Koch in a minute. Mayor Koch, remember him? Some of you, no, a lot of you wouldn't. But anyway, he, not him. So options, right? We want options. And we think of this and we look, and people say, you know what's the problem? You know what the problem is with your religion? It's too narrow. Which means you're narrow. So let me just challenge that for 1 second. When I fly on a plane, and I did a lot of flying, I want the pilot to take off when he's told, not before, not after. I want him to fly the plane right side up, not upside down. I want him to land when he's told, not before, not after. And I'm very narrow about that. Did you ever go to math class in school? Yeah. What was 2 plus 2 in your class? Was it ever 3? Was it ever 5? I wouldn't do that math. It's narrow. It's terrible. Hey, listen. Years ago, do you remember when you had the 2 kinds of gasoline, not counting the diesel? You know, you had regular gas, really regular, not regular unleaded, regular gas. And, you would know what to put in because they realized people aren't really bright. They would make it so you couldn't put the regular one in your tank if it was a unleaded. So, think about this. Gas is what, $3 a gallon? What'd you use? Use something else. Milk, water, juice, something. Don't do that. And they go, that's crazy. Why? Because that's the only thing that works. Well, that's narrow. That's narrow. Does narrow mean wrong? There's the logic class again. Missed that one. Narrow doesn't mean wrong. You do a lot of things in life that are narrow. You believe a lot of things that are narrow. Right? And you may not have even thought about them. But you are very specific on a variety of things. Right? And that's just the truth. So this is what Jesus told us. So at the end of it all, here's what Jesus is saying. I'm the great shepherd. I'm the one that's going to take care of you. All the things you're looking for, all the things you want in life, they're found in me. What about when I'm hurting? And we don't want to minimize that because people are hurting. I'm going to tell you this. Becoming a Christian does not make it, because pastors do this. I've heard it many times. You come to Jesus, your problems are going to go away. You're going to say, nope, you probably have more. Honestly. Because now you have a world of people out there that don't like you as soon as they find out. And, and you ever wonder why that is? That doesn't happen with any other religion. Isn't that something? Think about that.
Can you say that again?
Yeah, it doesn't happen with any other religion for the most part. Jews, it happened with throughout the years, right? Same God, right? And Christians, when they started believing in Christ, that was anathema to the world in many cases because his value system and the world value system clash. You cannot have one foot in his world and one foot in the regular world. And it's impossible to do. You can't navigate that. It's not going to happen. So you're either going to give up faith and keep it in your head that you still are, or you're going to say to the world, no more, and you're going to go that way. That's the only way to be successful in the Christian, road. But when you think of this, Jesus is saying, listen, remember the Old Testament? He said, do you remember the Passover? And this is the ending story, is this. He said, and I think this is what John had in mind, because John's gospel is filled with Old Testament allusions, pictures. Now remember, we're reading this as if it's all written. When Jesus was walking, there is no New Testament. It's not there. Everybody, when they talk about Scripture, is talking about the Old Testament. So they're naturally, where's their frame of reference? In the prophets, in Moses. So John likens everything to this. And he says, basically, think about the gate. Some of your Bibles, when you read this, said door, your NIV, right? And here's why that's so significant. Door is mentioned a lot, as is gate, in the Bible. So when Moses went to pull the Israelites out of Egypt, out of slavery, God did all the plagues. The final plague was the angel of death coming to kill the firstborn. It's the only time God gave Israel something they had to do. It wasn't a work to do something. It was a work, it was a choice they had to make. You don't have to do it, but if you want the angel of death to pass over your house and not come in, you must do it. So he took the blood of the lamb, which was a picture of what would become a practice over and over again for the next 1,500 years, till the Lamb of God died, shed his blood. So here's the connection I'm going to make for you. Jesus said, I am everything. I'm the great shepherd. I'm the bread of life. I'm the light. And we're going to hear more. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. I am all of this. And he says, and when he's saying this, he says, what did they have to do? They had to take the blood. And do you remember where they had to put it? On the door posts. So really what was going on here is what was needed for the angel of death to pass over is blood and a door. Right? And you say, why? Why? And it mentions that all the time. On the door, on the door. In Revelation 3:19, it says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and sup with him and he with me. That's written to Christians, not the unbeliever. Many people use that as their evangelism, their outreach for us. That's not what it is. He's talking to his church. He's saying, I'm knocking at your door. I'm knocking. If you open it, I'm going to come in. And to sup with someone, we think, oh, meal. That's fellowship. That's you sit down and eat with people in that day. That means you're accepting them. This is what you're doing. Otherwise, you don't invite them in. And so he says to them, take that blood and put it on the door. The doorway is the entrance to the house. And most homes didn't have fire codes. They didn't have a rear door. A lot of them. They had a door, but of course most of their homes were stone, so you weren't going to see a lot of fires, but there were some. So you do this. He says, take the blood, apply it to the door. And he says, and he's talking, to them. He's this, he's the great shepherd. He's the door. In Hebrews, in the book, you know what it says? Remember what the Old Testament said the priest had to do when it was sacrificing? They sacrificed at the altar. They would do all this stuff. Nobody could go into the Holy of Holies. That was the innermost place. Except one priest, one time a year, Yom Kippur. It was the only time, Day of Atonement. And that priest had to wake up well before dawn, go through a series of rituals of cleansing, symbolic, then go in, offer the sheep with the blood, sprinkle it on the altar, while all Israel was outside on their faces in the ground, being forgiven or the sins being covered over for national sin, right? For national sin. And so this is what's going on. So now Jesus takes that illustration, right? And he says in this moment, he said, they would have remembered, as soon as he starts talking about this, they would have pictured this. And so when they put the blood on the door, he is the door. It's his blood. It's for you. And if you come through that door, you will be safe, and the angel of destruction will not visit you. He will pass over you in the judgment day. You are no longer under the judgment. This is the picture. Jesus was telling them, I am God. I am God. And he said it over and over and over, so there was no way they could misunderstand it. They finally killed him for it. Why did they kill him? Do you remember? The Bible tells us. For blasphemy, for making himself out to be God. Right? For declaring himself king of the Jews. How did he do that? Palm Sunday, when he came into Jerusalem riding on the foal of a donkey. Micah 5:2, that's the prophet who foretold when Messiah comes, that's how he's coming. And he received worship that day. He never did that, except for privately, like with the blind man. But this time, it was a public coming. The crowds worshiped. They dropped palm branches, hailed the king, Hosanna in the highest. And then 4 days later, they killed him. Right? The same crowd yelled, crucify. So think about where you're at in life. Think about if you know Christ or if you don't. Think about, have you let Jesus into your heart? Have you walked through the door of his heart? Because in the book of Hebrews, you know what it says? In that temple, when the high priest did this, he had to go through something. What blocked his way? Thick curtain called the veil. That thick curtain, you know how thick that curtain was? Several feet. Several feet thick. They sewed it all together. So you could, if it fell on you, you'd die. So on the crucifixion, in that moment, an earthquake happens. And what happens to the veil? Torn in two. From top to bottom, not bottom to top like an earthquake would do. It opened the way to where? The presence of God. That's what's in the Holy of Holies. So Jesus said this, right? Or it says of Jesus in the book of Hebrews, that you have to go through the veil. And then he says, the veil is my flesh. The only way for you to come through that veil, that gate, that door, is through my blood. If you don't have that, you don't have life. You've committed to not go to heaven. Right? That's what it is. So you can change that today. You can change it by asking God. And it's not just words, it's a heartfelt thing. I'm going to close this in prayer, and when we're done, you could join us. We're going to do something a little bit different today. Normally what we do as a church is we just go get coffee, get another bagel, get something else, whatever you find, and come sit. We'll go in this room next door here, and then we just, talk about the service, talk about things. Doesn't even have to be about that. That's what we normally do. Today, because we're growing a little bit, we see some new faces, and I want to ask whoever wants to share a little bit about your story, how you got here, what where you've come from. It's a very safe environment. You can say, you know what, I'm not a believer yet, but I'm searching or I'm seeking, or you know what, my spouse dragged me here, and I'm not really getting it. That's okay too, right? That's fine, because it's God's timing, not yours. And so we just want to go. It could be testimonial in the sense of, tell us about your walk with God. If you don't have that, no more. Tell us about how you came to be where you are. Where do you live? I'm in this town. I came to this church because I'm looking for whatever. We just want to know, because when we do things like that, it gets people to know each other. And I'm going to tell you one last thing about me. I've had the big church. I've had the great problem, and it is a problem, where I would see people come and go every week. And my last church, I was there 13 years, and we planted that church like this one. And as it grew, it got to a point, there's so many people, right, about 800 or so or more, and a lot of those people never changed. They sat in the church for 10 years. There was no change in their life, the way they thought, the way they did things. And I go, what is it? And then you find out, and this is the worst thing as a pastor you could ever find out, but we did a kind of a deep dive, and you find out, well, the reason I chose this church is because they have better bagels. That's not a lie. And that's not the only people. right? There's more. That's why. I said, okay. You know what? I really like it. You're entertaining. Okay, great. You know, I don't, it's just this kind of stuff, and you're going, well, you know what? When you get too big, if your infrastructure does not grow with your teaching, then people are going to get overlooked. So I have no interest in having a church with more people unless there are more people that can be shepherded by people above them, and that they too then say, I can help, and I can do this for somebody, and I can do whatever. So these are really, you know, so we're at a phase in this church where we're going to put other leaders in place, and we'll describe that sometime, you know, in the future, but that's what's happening right now. And so we're glad you're here. I'm going to close us. We'll see you out there. Grab something. If you can stay, stay. And if you have to leave in the middle, go ahead. That's okay. You know, people stay for 15 minutes, stay for an hour. We don't care. Whatever works in your schedule and what you've got commitments to. So let me pray. Lord, thank you for this time. Thank you for the people that you've brought to this place today. And Lord, for what you're doing in our lives. Some of us might not know you and not even sure how to recognize your voice. And we just pray, God, that you would speak to your people, that you would call us out of darkness if that's where we are, that you would call us back to light if we've drifted, that you would bring us into a greater understanding of you, that we would have fellowship with each other. And Lord, I just ask, God, that you would make yourself known to all of us, and that we would, as brothers and sisters, sharpen each other like iron sharpens iron. And lead each of us, Lord, closer and closer to you, pointing to the only door, the only shepherd, the only light, the only bread that will fill us. And we pray, God, that you will hear our prayers, meet us where we are. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, guys, that's it. Thank you.